This was one of the games I had recently from a local tournament I played, and in this position, I had no clue what to do. We just finished the opening phase of the game, and we're heading towards the middle game, and my pieces look very nicely placed. The knight on e5 is on a central square, targeting f7 and c6, and also the d7 knight, and it's putting pressure in black's position. The dark squared bishop is placed on a beautifully open diagonal, maybe potential to go to g5 in the future if necessary, but it's well placed right now. The knight on c3 is well placed, targeting d5 and b5, making c5 hard to play. The queen on b3 only complements this, as it also eyes the d5 square, the b5 square, and also puts pressure on b6. And another thing to mention is the knight on e5 and the queen on b3 work well together to eye the f7 square, and this is very long term, but eventually if c5 ever happens, the position gets open, the d pawn moves or gets captured, then the f7 pawn is the next target, and the only thing defending it right now are the king and the rook. So if the rook moves away, my queen can potentially take. So these are ideas that are all in my mind. So my knights are well placed, queen is well placed. The rooks too, if c5 ever gets played, the two rooks will get open because c and d files are the files that are going to get open for them. And the reason why I keep mentioning c5 is this position is pretty closed. What is a closed position? It's basically when uh, there are more pawns on the board and they're all locked together in a structure like this where it's not easy to move them. And the only pawn breaks in this position are c5 or e4. And e4 looks pretty unlikely right now, and c5 is like most likely to happen in the future down the road. So c5 is the one thing that I'm monitoring, and my pieces are well placed for it. The bishop on e2 was I was a bit debating whether it should go to f3 or stay on e2 because I had ideas of playing bishop a6 and winning material, but obviously I can't play right now. It needs a piece protecting it, and I tried to find a few ways to make it work out, like somehow get my queen and the bishop to form a battery, but I did not see any way that's possible, especially with black's light square bishop well placed, um, covering this diagonal. So my queen was bound to stay on b3 for a while. So I decided to move my bishop to f3 in the game, aligning with the black's queen again, making sure that if c5 happens, there's more pressure on d5, and bishop is also, I would say, slightly more well placed. But okay, opponent also develops their rook, and this is like the main position where I had no clue what to do. I mean, look, I just improved basically the last piece I had that I was a bit iffy on whether it was go down e2 or not. But okay, in this position with the bishop on f3, I had no clue what to do. I was literally considering playing king h1 and back and forth for one or two moves, or bishop e2 and back to see what he would do and then respond to his threats, because my piece were well placed. But then I realized that was a bad idea because you want to be the person who makes the threats and calls the game. And that's the easier way to put pressure on your opponent and win the game. And in this position, I realized, okay, my pieces are well placed, but in the next step to continue is to think about what pieces in my opponent's position are weak. And then c6 comes to mind, but it's well defended. And okay, I potentially have two attackers, maybe the bishop, but again, after a few lines, you see that this pawn isn't that well that it can be easily targeted with another piece. It actually turns out, when I'm analyzing with the engine, knight takes c6 is possible, and it's a piece sacrifice after queen takes, knight takes d5, and white gets huge initiative. But okay, let's be honest, most of us are not going to be playing knight takes c6 because we're not going to see it, or even if you do, you need to have the guts to play it. But anyway, another thing I looked at is f7. Again, f7 will potentially be weak. Right now, no knight takes f7 tactics are there. I have to wait for moves like c5 to open up the diagonal for my queen and so on. And then the next thing I look at is the bishop, light square bishop. It's pretty powerful. It's one of black's strongest piece. So the next thing that came to mind is, can I somehow get rid of it? And I looked at ways to attack it, and the first move that came to mind is g4. And if you're anything like me, you feel pretty scared to move the pawn in front of your king, because it looks like because you basically open up your king to be attacked. But in this case, I realized black has no pieces on the king side much other than like the knight and the two bishops, and there's no way he can take advantage of me playing g4. And the good thing about g4 is once g4 happens, this bishop has really no good square. If it goes back to g6, I can consider taking basically taking his bishop pair. And if he doesn't go to g6 and if he goes to e6, his bishop is now much more passive. And okay, it can't go anywhere like d3, c2, or b1. And if it goes to e4, I could potentially again consider trading it with my c3 knight. And yes, even though my knights on e5 and c3 are well placed, like I mentioned, his bishop on f5 is also very well placed, covering squares like c2, d3, and it's really annoying because I can't really do much with my queen now because it's kind of stuck. So I played g4 in the game, and as you saw my reasoning behind, improving my pieces was the first step I considered, but it was not the only one. After that, the next few plans I thought of was what are the weaknesses in my opponent's position and what are his good pieces so I can trade them off. In this case, his bishop on f5 is like one of his best pieces, and I want to trade it off. So I looked at ways to trade it off, and the move that came to mind is here's g4, and I played it. And before I played it, I also made sure, is there a way he can take advantage of this move? And there's no way he can, because moves like h5 don't work in this position, because at the very least I can just push the pawn forward and lock the position down. My king is all safe, and when I mention h5, I mean later down the road, not in this position, because the bishop is hanging obviously. Anyway, he goes back with the bishop because he wants to keep his bishop pair. And again, we're in this position. What do I want to do? Do I want to push g5? I decided not to because this is overextending. This knight can just move to it can't move to e4, but it can just move to e8, and this g5 pawn is pretty overextended, and the black knight is rerouting. Let's say if I play g5, the knight goes to e8, and it's black is clamped, and I have a clear attack. Then g5 would be a good move, but here he goes back and then he reroutes to d6 potentially. And also this pawn is overextended and I have no clear attack. The queen is all the way on the other side of the board. The two rooks are not really gonna help to attack on the king side. The only thing I have are two bishops and this knight, and they're not going to checkmate the king, unfortunately, because black also has pieces around his king. So g5 I consider doesn't work. And then I looked at my other pieces, and they seemed well placed right now. I didn't know what to do. So, but one thing I realized is the bishop on f3 can potentially be weak, because yes, I'm targeting black's queen on this diagonal, but let's say he does play c5 and a position arises where it's his turn to move, he can capture my bishop in an open position because this bishop is undefended. The only thing defending is my knight, but let's say a trade happens down the road and c5 or something happens and he gets in d5 with tempo somehow, my bishop is undefended. So it's one of these undefended pieces in my position, and I was considering playing king g2. So that was one of the ideas I had. And then another idea was moving my knight, because the d pawn is now well defended actually. The bishop on e6 protects it. And then I realized even if I get in knight b5, I never really won't have an option to play it. Like, okay, I will play it, but I don't have an option to go for it because, okay, c7 and d6 are well protected with the rooks and the bishop and queen. So I decided the knight is better placed on e2 because it has potential to go to f4 or g3 and later help start an attack on the king side. So as you saw, I mentioned g5 was an option, but I didn't play it because it's overextending and I didn't have many pieces to support the attack. So what do? I build on. I'm like, okay, so I need more pieces. Then I will go to the party. g3 and f4 are key ideas. Maybe playing bishop g5 or bishop h2. Somehow making room for my knight to go to f4. Maybe get this bishop. Make black have a weak e6 pawn. So these are ideas that are slowly coming to my mind as I think of black's best pieces, black's weaknesses, and so on. So improving your position is not the only thing that you should think of when you're trying to basically put pressure on your opponent. So in this position I played knight e2, and then opponent plays h6 because he was probably scared of some g5 move, or maybe he's considering playing g5 himself. I mean this, and making left for the king, because he saw some threats coming towards the king side, so he quickly reacted to somehow stop it. And I play king g2 as I mentioned before. I just want to keep my bishop protected, and I wanted to see what he's gonna do after h6, because if he plays g5, I just go back and now h4 is the threat. So here's another thing. I personally don't think h6 is a good move because uh, it's only a weakness. Later that can be targeted down the road with g5, or if he plays g5 himself, I drop back with the bishop and play h4. So chess is not only a game of slowly improving your positions and trying to target your opponent's weaknesses, it's also giving him time to basically make worse moves. Your opponent is a Magnus Carlsen or Stockfish. They are going to make mistakes. So if you slowly start putting pressure on them, like g4, knight e2, bringing the pieces towards the king side, they will start to feel threatened and they'll play moves like h6, which I think aren't good because they're only giving you more weaknesses to target. Because now if I play g5, he can't move his knight. He will, because I'm also attacking his pawn, so you have to recapture. So you see how I'm basically getting more forcing lines as I slowly improve my position. So here I play king g2, protecting the light square bishop because I saw a few lines where my knight would eventually have to move and the bishop would be unprotected. So I play king g2. It's not one of the best moves, but again, practically speaking, I think it's a decent move for my level. As my opponent was 1900 USCF, and I just simply protect the light square bishop, and I also facilitate my rooks to later swing down if they need to, and the files on the king side potentially open. So again, it's about targeting your opponent's weaknesses and then slowly facilitating movement for your pieces according to those plans. g4, then king g2, allowing the rooks to come, knight e2, because attacking on the king side was my focus. Now opponent played knight f8. Again, he realized that h6 was a weakness. He needed more pieces to start defending his king. He wanted to make sure he was safe. And okay, the knight on f8 and f6 are well placed to cover squares, so this isn't going to be an easy attack for white. The next move I play in this position is just bishop g3, as I mentioned before, making room for my knight on f4 to take the light squared bishop. I mean, I wasn't 100% sure whether I would want to capture or not, but again, the knight going to f4 does put pressure on the bishop, and it also creates ideas of later down the road playing a h4 g5, and yeah, knight and f4 again is just more central. It's more towards king, making room, slowly improving the position, targeting the weak king. Knight g6 here, and then I take. And again, all it takes is a few moves of slowly adding pressure. Opponent sees I played bishop g3 and another piece is coming closer to the attack. So he wants to trade some pieces. He wants to feel safe, especially especially for you folks who play online 5 minutes, 3-minute chess. They won't have much time to think and analyze. They want to make sure everything's safe and sound, and they'll play moves like h6, knight f8, knight g6, and they want to make sure they trade off pieces and their king is safe. And when they play these moves, okay, at the end of the day, I'm not checkmating or winning material immediately, but if you go back a few moves, when I played g4, it wasn't clear. Black had no clear weaknesses, and I just wanted to trade black's best bishop. And now a few moves fast forward, there's a weak pawn on g6 that's potentially I can target and win. The light squares around the king are weak. Knight is going to f4 and it's going to target g6 and the e6 bishop. And the e6 bishop is more undefended than before, and it's also not doing much because it's blocked by its own pawns and also my pawn chain. So you see how slowly trying to trade your opponent's best pieces, slowly pushing forward, making timely pawn moves is more important than just improving your pieces' positions and waiting down. And here I play knight f4. I target the bishop and the g6 pawn, and he has to go back, protecting his bishop and the pawn. And in this position, I go back to d3 because I realized, okay, knight. Well, I went to f4. I basically successfully forced the light square bishop to go back to f7, where it's basically stuck behind its own pawns. Think for a moment. Compare the bishop on f5 and f7. Which one's much better? The f5 bishop was much better, looking into my position, targeting c2, b1, d3, making sure my queen or rook can't access that square. But now the queen has potential to go to these squares and further target this pawn. And okay, in this position, I was considering queen d3 or queen c2, putting pressure on the c pawn while also putting pressure on the g6 pawn. But after a move like queen d3 or queen c2, I realized, like, okay, he has g5, and I didn't see a really clear way to target his light squares because he has a light squared bishop around his king. So I started looking for other options, and I'm like, okay, I successfully forced this bishop back. What are new weaknesses? I mean, I didn't see anything else. I mean, the only weakness I still saw was g6, but I realized targeting this way from d3 wasn't enough. I needed to grab his light squared bishop somehow, and then target the g6 pawn, so the light squares would be more weak. So then I realized, okay, how would I get this bishop? Then I realized knight on e5 would be pretty strong, helping me target c6 and f7 and g6 at the same time. So how did I do that? I went back to d3. So the knight went from c3 to f4 back to d3 to go to e5. So the original knight on e5 traded on g6 to create a weakness, and then I'm using another knight to and rerouting it to put on e5. Opponent also tries to develop his pieces, knight e4 hitting my dark squared bishop, and here I have a critical decision. Do I move my dark squared bishop and try to save it, or do I just continue with my plan? And I'm fine to give up my dark squared bishop. And in this position, I realized playing knight e5 and basically threatening to take the bishop here, because even though the bishop is bad, as I mentioned before, if I take it, I force the king out, and this g6 pawn is very, very weak. And even if he plays g5, the light squares are very weak, and I can easily jump in. And not to mention g5, I have h4. h4 is always a consideration. Here he takes my dark square bishop, but here I thought of the move I'll play after. So before I played knight e5, I realized, like, okay, knight e5, let's say he plays knight takes g3. In my mind, I already decided before that I'll take the bishop immediately. So intermediate move, basically forcing the king to come out and take, and then I take with the pawn. And again, here I had a decision whether I should take with the king or my pawn. I was considering king for a moment because I didn't want to ruin my pawn structure, but then I realized black is getting initiative and the rook can potentially go to f5, and the f pawn is also weak. So I take with the g3 pawn, opening the f file for my own rook to target his king, and also not giving him any initiative with queen checks. He goes back with his king to stay safe, but now e4, pawn break in the center, using my queen on b3 because this d pawn is pinned, and the light square is now very weak. Remember all the way in the beginning when I said the queen on it is on this light square diagonal, and it's aligned with the king, and it might become important when my opponent plays c5. Well, he didn't play c5, but I played e4, and this was the second pawn break in my head. e4 looked pretty unlikely back then when there was a knight, there's a bishop, and there's a pawn. But as the position evolved, I was able to play e4, and the queen on b3 came to life. Here he stepped off the diagonal because what else? And then I just take, and actually I thought I could win a pawn here. I was very low on time, actually. I had like 1 minute on the clock, and I tried to simplify pretty quickly, and because I thought I was winning a pawn here. I'm actually not, because if he takes with the queen and then I take the pawn, he can actually just sack the rook, and then after an exchange he comes back with a check and he wins the rook back, and he's just up a piece. So after this trade, I'm actually not winning the pawn, but I thought I was. An opponent didn't play queen takes, he played rook takes because he was low on time too, and I did end up winning the pawn in the game. And yeah, I'm up a pawn. He still has a g6 weakness, and my pieces are still pretty active, and I went on to win the game. One thing to mention is, if rook takes, if exchanging the rooks and winning the pawn was not the right move, what was the right way to continue? And now looking back, I think a move like queen d3, putting more pressure, and then slowly pushing forward h4, maybe rook d e1, slowly again. Now there's room to improve your pieces and target opponent's king. So the position slowly evolved after all this mess. So hopefully you get the idea of not only thinking about how to improve your pieces, but also targeting your opponent's weaknesses, and more importantly, trading your opponent's best pieces. This all started with the core idea of trying to trade my opponent's best piece. And I looked at his position, and this bishop was very active, like annoyingly active. And I thought, how do I get rid of it? and I all started with g4. And don't be scared to play moves like g4 if you don't see a way your opponent can punish you. Like, okay, your king is weak, it's open, but does your opponent actually have a way to do it? I mean, like, attack you and take advantage of your king's vulnerability? No. And also, I have literally two bishops and a knight near, around my king. This knight also has potential to go help my king. Like, there's nothing here. So g4 works, and I basically force this bishop to go back to a worse square, and then I don't look back. I mean, I realize this bishop is now protecting the d pawn well enough. Knight b5 doesn't look as good as taking the knight back to e2 and rerouting to f4, slowly trying to attack the king because my pawn is already on g4, and also realizing not going to the immediate temptation of playing g5 and like going full Uga mode because opponent knight goes back to e8, goes back to d6, and this pawn is weak. And I'm reiterating this because these are the moves you have to find. After moves like g4 and knight e2, the position will play by itself. Like king g2, bishop g3. These aren't the top engine moves, but they're top like 5. Like they're good enough to keep the advantage for you and keep putting pressure on your opponent. The main moves you have to find, and again in this position, the computer really likes g4 after rook to d8 from black. So I hope you learned something and catch you next time. Bye.